And although the country had soldiers willing to fight, its arsenal was barely existent. Finding themselves outnumbered and outgunned, the Israelis were nevertheless defiant. They had no choice. Unlike their enemies, they had no fallback position to which they could retreat. An Israeli loss would certainly result in the complete destruction of the Jewish nation. Fighting next to the Israelis were weary Holocaust survivors who were plunged into battle after surviving World War II. Additionally, there were volunteers from countries such as South Africa, Canada, and Turkey. And although the Americans who fought on Israel's side were small in number, they were poised to make a dramatic difference in the war's outcome. It is under these circumstances that we continue our remarkable story, Israel's Forgotten Heroes.
When the state was declared, it was euphoria. People danced all night, danced to horror, bonfires, fireworks, and of course the next day, 7 Arab armies started advancing towards Palestine, what we called first Eretz Israel, and then the State of Israel. We had almost nothing. We were 500,000 people in Israel at that time, of which 100,000 were children, 100,000 were old people, 100,000 were women, and we were left really with 100,000 people between 16 and 25 that we could utilize to fight. But we had no weapons. We had World War I Canadian rifles, only the weapons we got from the British and smuggled in, no heavy weapons, no airplanes, and the Arab armies were equipped with all the latest tanks and airplanes.
The dancing and the singing and all that didn't last long, unfortunately. Next morning, I remember, we had the first alarm, air raid alarm in Tel Aviv. And then we heard a few bombs falling in Tel Aviv. So I saw about 1 or 2 Egyptian planes over Tel Aviv. That was the first casualties in Tel Aviv.
There were a number of experienced military men in other countries who gave the Jews very little chance. And there were others in this country, too, who wouldn't have given the Jews a plug nickel of a chance. One of them was a very experienced general who by then was the American Secretary of State. That was General Marshall. He couldn't anticipate that the Jews really had a serious chance against what appeared to be overwhelming odds of creating a viable defense and ultimately protecting their sovereignty.
We didn't have any planes. It was there were 2 or 3, training little planes that they had a permission from the British to learn, a little plane from the Haganah. There was nothing, what they used to throw down on the, on the Arabs. They used to have hand grenades, came lower down with that little airplanes and throw the hand grenades. Molotov bottles, that's what the bombs. There was no bomb then. There was nothing.
At the beginning, before they got into American bombs, they were trying different bombs. They didn't have bombs, so they went ahead. They took a sewer pipe, cut in there, was about this long, packed with powder, and they put a little pipe in there, and they gave me a fuse, and they said, you light the fuse, count up 10, throw it in, and throw it overboard. Well, I'm looking at this thing, and it was heavy, it weighed about 100 pounds. It was heavy, a sewer pipe with the power on it. So I said, okay, let me try one, see what happens. I went up, I lit the fuse, dropped it into the bomb, and I went to get it overboard. It started getting hooked on the side. I couldn't get it overboard. Finally, I had to do a somersault, and got rid of it. And I don't know whether it went off or not, but that was it. No more of those bombs,
Our plane had 10 crates, like egg crates, where they had 5-pound bombs in each crate. And of course, not knowing who would be throwing out the bombs, the captain says, Eddie, you're the bomb trucker. The navigator had a big job. With one hand, he had to hold the door open, and with the other hand, he held my belt so I wouldn't fall out.
I asked them what type of aircraft we would be flying, and they said, leave it to the Jews, we'll have the best aircraft. I said, will we be flying the type of aircraft I had flown in the American Army Air Corps, P-40s and P-51s. They said, don't worry about it, you'll get those aircraft or better aircraft. And I was satisfied that I was looking forward to doing whatever I could to help out. I came home and told my mother and father that I was going off to another war. I had been away for 4 years. Maybe 2 years at a time I hadn't seen my family. And they were quite upset, but I told them I was going anyway.
There were very few Jewish fighter pilots, few Jewish bomber pilots, few Jewish transport pilots in Palestine. And yet, 1948, post-World War II, a modern war had to be fought with modern weapons. It had to be fought with P-51s and with C-46 Curtiss commandos. And the people who knew how to use those weapons didn't really exist in Palestine. And so, really, they had to be found abroad. And again, I can give you sort of another concrete expression of the dominant presence of Americans and other English-speaking volunteers. Even until 1950, more than a year after the war ended, the official language of radio communication in the Israeli Air Force was English. It wasn't Hebrew. Because, again, the Air Force was so dominated by the English speakers that English had to be accommodated as the language of communication. The first general in the Israeli army was an American. The first commander of the Israeli Navy was an American. The first head of Air Force intelligence was an American. The first tank commander in the Israeli army was a Canadian. Israel's first chief test pilot was an American. An American code specialist became critically involved in the establishment of the Army security procedures and actually broke the Jordanian code during the war. The list really goes on from there. They really played a very magnificent and I think compelling role in Israel's victory in the war. And there are a significant number of firsts associated with the Americans who came to Israel.
We had to get the airplanes out of the United States and down to Panama before April 15, 1948, after which date, forget it. You couldn't fly these kind of aircraft out of the United States. So it became a tremendous job to get the aircraft ready. We were to get to Zadich in Czechoslovakia, a former German fighter strip.
Czechoslovakia was a principal source of weaponry. It was not provided only for ideological or even for diplomatic reasons, by the way. They needed the dollars, and the Israelis were willing to pay in hard cash.
We were buying the Czech model of the Me-109, which was called the M-109, but they had produced them for the Germans. Now they were producing them for us.
When I got to the field, I saw these strange-looking aircraft I had never seen before. They were supposedly Me-109s, but these Me-109s had inferior engines that didn't belong in Me-109s, engines that had far less power. The propellers were different, the armament was different, and so forth. And then they stuck me into a two-place, so I'll call it an Me-109. I took off and did some aerobatics, came back, landed. I had 35 minutes on that. When I landed, they told me, you're going to leave for Israel tonight. Now, usually in the American Air Force, we used to get maybe 100 or 120 hours on an aircraft before you went into an operational squadron. Here I had 35 minutes on this aircraft. It was all in the metric system, and I didn't even have enough time to really get to know the cockpit. They took the Me-109, took it apart, put it in a C-46, and I was on my way to Israel.
The mission of the operation was to fly anything that we could find in anywhere that could be brought to Zadich. And it had to be, of course, munitions. That's what we were really interested in carrying. And that's what we did carry. They'd bring them out in trucks. They were loaded, tied down. The crews came out. The crews took off. They'd fly into Israel, where most of the time we had a previous crew who had had a night's rest. They got on the airplane, took it back. And when they arrived in Israel, they landed on a dirt field with automobile headlights, If you can imagine yourself flying around and you know the airport is right there, nobody's going to turn on the lights and nobody's going to let you away to lead, and you don't have gas to go anywhere. The radio communication was very poor.
When we turned in, the wingtip caught the hill and slammed us into the ground. The cargo in the cargo compartment sliding forward instantly killed Mo Rosenbaum, our navigator. I was turned around in my seat because I was tapping the altimeter. That's the reason why I was the only one that wasn't knocked unconscious. Norm bounced his head off the glare shield and was knocked out. Eddie Stirak, the radio operator, his seat snapped off, and I thought he was dead. And I was immediately on fire. So I unhooked my seatbelt, got out, and I tried to go through the compartment, and I realized it was jammed, what had happened. And I shook Norm away and opened up his window and kicked him out. We got Eddie out, and I jumped out.
They faced personal risks. They had to leave behind family. They had to interrupt careers. There's an expression in the Talmud that in a place where there are no men, be yourself a man. And that's how I think these people looked at the situation. They didn't say, well, someone else will take care of it. There are people there who can fight, or there are other foreign volunteers who will go. They themselves took it on their own shoulders to go.
Every day, fighter planes were dismantled. They acquired 2 airplanes to hold them, but the empty space was filled with other ammunition and things. The crews would take off, leave 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, fly a night flight into Israel, getting there in time to unload and get out before the Egyptian fighter planes could strafe us on the ground. And that was basically the routine. It was all faith. Faith that it was going to be all right, and that somebody had to do it.
There had been 1 or 2 fighters in Israel, but about 2 days before I got there, the Arab Spitfires, 4 or 6 Arab Spitfires came over and strafed the hangars and knocked out all but 2 aircraft. It was pathetic. We had no aircraft. We had no pilots. We had nothing. But the Arabs didn't know that. Later on, when we found out by telephone from the south that there were, say, 6 or 8 Spitfires coming in from Egypt to attack Israel, we would scramble squadrons that didn't exist. We would scramble 105 Squadron, 110 Squadron, 115 Squadron. We had no 110, 115 squadrons. So we would scramble 75 aircraft when we had 2 usually unserviceable aircraft on the ground, with 1 pilot with a broken arm and another pilot who just landed.
I was the youngest American at the time who was over there. I went into combat 5 days after getting into the unit. We had no basic training. That was ridiculous. I was put in an armored unit. You know what the armored unit consisted of? Israeli armored cars made on truck chassis. You know, there were miserable things that the Israelis built themselves, and we had half-tracks. We had no artillery of any kind. The heaviest thing we had were heavy machine guns and light machine guns. And that was the armored unit. We never did have any tanks. The whole Israeli army had 3 tanks. Our weapons were inferior, but luckily we were fighting armies that weren't much better than we were.
Although millions of Jews all over the world were holding their breaths and perhaps even subliminally shared the dire premonitions of some of these professional military men, it didn't look that way to the Israelis, as we'll call them now. Those who had grown up in Palestine and who had long, in a sense, internalized the tradition of vigorous resistance, had a good understanding of their Arab enemy. They had fought with them in the years of the Mandate. They had had a lot of experience of skirmishes with them and of fighting with them. They thought they knew how to fight them. And all they felt they needed were just a few more recruits and a little more weaponry, and they would be able to handle matters on their own. And they had a secret weapon, which certainly was never vouchsafed to the Arabs. It was called no alternative.
At that time, the Egyptians were 25 miles from Tel Aviv. They were coming up the coast. And there was really very little, if anything, to stop them. It could have been the end of the war for Israel.
We got a report there were 4 Spitfires flying to the north. We took off into the haze, and my eyes were tearing and I was sweating. The cockpit must have been 120 degrees. And I look way ahead of me and I see shadows. 4 Spitfires ahead of me, but slightly below. I don't know where the gun sight, you have to put a gun sight on, you have to put your gun switches on, and I'm not sure where all these switches are. So I'm throwing switches, my flaps are coming down, my landing gear is coming down, I'm going up again, I'm flowing it. Finally, I got the gun sight switch on, but I had passed them. In the meantime, they saw us, and the 4 of them broke off into the haze. I pulled up, and I finally saw a shadow, and I wasn't sure whether it was my friend Morty or whether it was one of the Spitfires. And we started dogfight, and I noticed it's not an ME-109, and it's a Spitfire. And we got into a pretty hairy dogfight, and I shot him down. That was the first action, the first fighter aircraft shot down by the Israeli Air Force. There had been 2 other aircraft shot down, 2 C-47s that were bombing Tel Aviv were shot down by Morty a few days prior to my getting there.
He shot down an English fighter plane that the Egyptians had. They had been armed by England at that particular time. And there were 2 other ME-109s. This was the first flights at the ME-109s. Remember, they were dismantled in Czechoslovakia, and Czech crews plus the Israelis getting the know-how were assembling them and flying them out. That turned at Fallujah, because the Egyptians shouldn't believe they had been told that the Israelis had no aircraft and they had no big guns, which was some truth, but a few weeks earlier. Subsequently, we got them. I say we because I was part of it. I couldn't help that. And as a result of that, they stopped. They never got any further.
The real heroes, one should say the silent army, if you like, of Israel's resistance was the Jewish people worldwide. They provided the political leverage. They provided the bone marrow, the financial bone marrow. They provided most of the weaponry. And they provided, not least of all, the desperate influx of refugees by the tens and tens of thousands.
I remember that they kept bringing to the base where I was in Telefinski, from the ships, from the illegal boats, young people that they survived the Holocaust, refugees. They brought them straight to that boot camp because they needed people, we needed soldiers.
Every day, officers from the various fighting units, and there were only 8 brigades in the Israeli army. So representatives of the brigades or the battalions would come up to Telefinski and they would say, who arrived today? You know, what kind of volunteers, what kind of skills? Because they were looking for all kinds of skills that they didn't have. So when I got there, they needed drivers for the half-tracks to take the place of those who had been killed. And so I moved into the 79th Armored Regiment. Before I got there, the 79th was brought against Latrun. And they brought DPs off the ships, very much like the ship I came on. They gave them guns and put them into that 79th Armored Battalion.
They were young. They didn't speak any word, only like from Romanian Jews, from Poland, and from Hungary. That was the 3 countries that the survivors used to come. I spoke a few languages then, and I was speaking to them Yiddish. They didn't know 1 word Hebrew. I spoke some Polish, and I became like a big brother to them. They were telling me stories then, that They know that they have relatives in Israel. They have aunts, uncles, what their parents used to tell them. They didn't have a chance even to see them. They brought them straight to the base. A few weeks, that's all what it took to train them, to give them, you know, basic training, how to handle a rifle. That's all what we had then. And we went there. I took action. There was a small village by the name Kfar Ono. One evening we were sent out from the base and we took that village. But later on, unfortunately, that was that big battle on Latrun. It was an infamous place. There were a lot of casualties there. Many of those refugees, those survivors, never came back.
There were men who were killed the same day they got off the ship. Imagine, they survived the Holocaust. They got all the way over to Israel. They were given a rifle, and they died the first day they got there.
I used always to calm them down. They were crying on my shoulder. I was really a big brother to them. I was 30 years old, and they were a little young. What were they? In the early 20s even. Something like that, the early 20s. They never saw their families even.
There are some experiences that leave an indelible imprint on one's soul. Experiences that give meaning to our lives, validate our existence, and help define who we are as individuals. Such was the case for these heroic volunteers from abroad who, despite the perils involved, played a decisive part in the founding of Israel. They risked their most precious possession in the process, their lives. From the safe haven of history, we can now fully appreciate how dangerous and significant their task really was. Yet at the time, these individuals could little afford the luxury of reflection. For as one of them aptly described the situation, it was live today, die tomorrow. And many volunteers indeed made the ultimate sacrifice, fighting for what they believed in. Now, more than 2 generations later, we can look back on the roles they played and the impact they made on world history. For most, it was an experience that changed their lives forever. And now, the conclusion of Israel's Forgotten Heroes.
There probably is no parallel, certainly in the 20th century, for a state that was attacked from the outside literally the very day that it was founded, and yet that was Israel's case.
We were at the right time, in the right area, in the right position to pull this thing off. If we were a little later or a little earlier, who knows? But everything clicked in.
The very day that it was founded, it was attacked by all of its Arab neighbors. In some instances supported by Arab countries beyond Israel's borders. And yet Israel was able to withstand that invasion. And yet, until the very day that Israel became a state, the British were in control of the country. They would not let the Jews bring in weapons. They would not let the Jews form military units or train openly. And so it's simply astonishing that with virtually no infrastructure, with no trained soldiers located there in the country, that kind of an invasion was able to be repelled. It's incredible, and I don't think that there's a parallel to it in the 20th century.
When I was in the cockpit being shot up and on fire a few times, I always looked from outside at myself in the cockpit. I wasn't the guy that was in a precarious position. I was watching myself from somewhere else. And I figured